Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this workshop. So the title of my talk is Realizing Richardson's Dream, Developing Modeling Capability at ExCALIBUR for the Met Office. So I thought I'd better tell you who Richardson is. Lewis 5 Richardson was the first person to attempt a numerical weather prediction calculation way back in 1916, 1918. When he was a volunteer in an ambulance unit on the Western Front during the First World War. And he tried to do what we would think of now as a very simple calculation, where the calculation over Europe for a 7x7 grid with 5 levels, so a pretty coarse resolution, about 250 kilometer resolution. And he took 2 time steps, each of 3 hours. And that took him 2 years to do by hand. And he got the answer completely wrong. And he got the answer completely wrong for 2 reasons. First of all, the input data, which he took from weather reports from newspapers, was wrong. So his starting point was wrong. And the second thing, he didn't know about some maths. He didn't know about the CFL condition to do with the size of the grid spacing and the time step. So in fact, his time step would have to be much shorter. So we'd have to do many more time steps and do more calculations. But that wasn't known at the time. However, in 1922, so almost 100 years ago, he wrote a paper, Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. And the idea of weather and climate being one of the first things to do with computation is as Professor Fu alluded to it, but it actually goes back further than that. So he recognized the problem was parallel. And he reckoned you could do a numerical weather prediction if you had 64,000 computers. Now, back in 1922, a computer was a person, someone who computed. And so here is Richardson's dream, where you would have a hall with many people in, 64,000 people in, each doing part of the calculation over their own grid cells by hand, and then passing bits of paper and communication. So he recognized the problem with parallel. He also knew that you'd have to synchronize the calculation. So there's a conductor in the middle with a torch highlighting bits that need to be done faster or slower to keep everyone in sync together. So he already recognized that the problem could be done in parallel before we even had any kind of machine to try and automate the process. So we now have machines that have 64,000 processors in or more. Professor Xu showed you the Sunway Light machine, the Sunway Qinhui Light machine. The Met Office supercomputer is perhaps a little bit smaller, and it's made with conventional CPUs. There's a picture of it here, lit up in garish green and purple lights. But this is a machine that has 250,000 processors in. And the reason we've got to this stage with having so many processors in is because it's kind of the end of the free lunch, where you would just buy a computer that would then be, your future computer would be faster than your previous one. They're not faster anymore, and this has been true now for quite a long time. And it's really a problem with power density. This is a plot from Intel. They made it in the year 2000, showing that we would have a problem from about 2005 onwards, in that you can't keep making the processors faster. You can make more processors or have more cores on a single piece of silicon, but you can't make them faster. Hence this explosion of parallelism we have to exploit. And this solves the microscopic power problem, but we still have the macroscopic power problem. There's a 3 megawatt power supply for the Met Office supercomputer there. And of course, if we keep going, we have to look at alternative architectures, because eventually we run out of power. This is a paper by Peter Kogi at ISC 2015, updating the energy model for future exascale systems. So it's basically, can we make a computer capable of doing an exaflop for less than 20 megawatts of power using a CPU-like architecture? And the answer is no, you can't. And there's a picture of Oliver Twist asking for some more power, but there isn't any more. We've used it all. So we have to look at alternative architectures, and that might be something more like a GPU, and here we see the picture of the Oak Ridge Supercomputer Summit, which has a lot of GPUs in it, in order to 4,000 nodes, each with 6 GPUs, to try and exploit a huge amount of parallelism to try and keep the power consumption down. But even this machine takes a huge amount of power. So parallel computing is exploded, and the amount of parallelism we're having to exploit has greatly increased. And at the same time, the calculations we want to do are limited by our computing resources. They're limited by the size and the speed. The size and the speed of the calculation we can do limits the science we can do. And there are a number of things we might want to try and do. We might want to try and increase the resolution for greater accuracy. We might want to increase the processing of the number of observations that we include. That would again increase the accuracy. We might want to put more things into the model, increase the complexity. That requires more computation. And in order to understand the error and uncertainty, we want to do multiple simulations of the same thing. So an ensemble of perturbed initial conditions. And again, that takes much more computing resources. But if we can't compute X and Y faster, can we compute X and Y simultaneously? But we have to think about the dependency, because if Y depends on X, we can't necessarily compute them at the same time. And this goes back to the synchronicity that Richardson already recognized. So the Met Office has had funding approved for a new supercomputer, which it's for a 10-year program. Ideally, initially we get a 6 times increase in our current supercomputer, followed by a further factor of 3 for an 18 times increase in the second half of that period. Some of the machine may in fact not be located in the UK if that turns out to be a good way of reducing the cost of the power consumption. If we can locate some of that supercomputer where there is cheaper electricity or cheaper cooling, or using electricity that comes from a sustainable or renewable power supply, because the amount of power this machine will take will be quite significant. And in total, the funding for this is more than £1 billion for this 10-year, £1 billion for this 10-year project. So this procurement is currently in the process of ongoing. So I can't announce anything about that yet, or certainly about the outcome. So what are we going to do with this supercomputer? Well, what goes into a weather and climate model, they're quite specialized, and a lot of that comes from the domain, specifically the domain specifics of what we're doing. The most obvious thing being the geometry. It's spherical, but it's not completely spherical, because we have orography, mountains that stick up out of the surface of the Earth. The other thing to note is the atmosphere is very thin and vertically stratified. There is such a thing called the Kármán line, which is about 100 kilometers up. And below the Kármán line is almost all the atmosphere, if you take it by mass. Above the Kármán line, the individual gas particles are so widely separated that perhaps it's not even a gas anymore. And that's only 100 kilometers up. Now, I've drawn a diagram of the Earth there, but I've drawn it to scale with an atmosphere that's 600 kilometers deep. If I drew it as 100 kilometers, it's just a thin blue line around the outside of the Earth. So the atmosphere really is that thin. So the depth of the radius of the Earth is much, much greater than the depth of the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is really, really very thin. Not only that, it rotates. It's not in thermal equilibrium. There's an atmosphere, there's an ocean, there's sea and sea ice and land surfaces, and there's moist, chemical and biological processes. So this is a very complex system. All these subcomponents can exchange energy, and in fact they can even exchange material, particularly moisture, which is really important for weather and climate. So it's a very complex domain, it's multi-component and it's multi-scale. And as Professor Fu alluded to, mentioned earlier, models are very large. There are hundreds of thousands, or perhaps millions of lines of code. They take a very long time to develop. They could have a very long lifetime as well, very long-lived pieces of software. But they also undergo continuous development. New scientific components are updated, new scientific innovation comes into them, and so you have to manage that process as well. So it undergoes continuous development as well. Okay, so this slide shows kind of how they might be coupled together. So you might have individual simulation system, which has got an atmosphere model along with some chemistry processes, a land surface, marine processes and earth system processes, and then a separate program running that couples those things together, as well as things controlling the input and the output. So the software of a weather and climate model is actually very complicated as well. I'm mostly going to talk about the atmospheric component today, But all the things I say kind of apply to the other components, and in fact to the coupler, which allows these things to run, these independent applications to run and still talk to each other. So the Met Office has a very successful weather and climate model called the Unified Model. However, it's based on a long lat grid and on a structured mesh. And as you can see from the diagram on the left, then the poles, at the poles, these lines of longitude get very close together. And this causes us problems both for accuracy and for communication around the poles. So in parallel computation, we have lots of communication around the poles because the grid cells get very close together. Wind speeds, like you have transport of material, wind flowing across many grid cells at that point because the grid cells are so small. So this causes us a problem with scaling. It's a finite difference model, and it uses a semi-implicit time step. So recognizing this was going to cause us a problem, we would eventually limit the amount of parallelism we could exploit. The Met Office decided that it would replace the modeling system with a entirely new model, which we're calling LFRIC after Lewis Fry Richardson, because we want to be able to calculate on these huge computers and realize Richardson's dream. So the idea behind this is we keep the accuracy, maintain the successful science that we had in the but we improve the scalability, and at the same time it allows us to exploit other programming models than we could in the unified model. So the new model is built on a cube sphere mesh, which is shown on the right, done as an unstructured mesh using a finite element mixed finite element method to try and maintain the accuracy that we had with the structured mesh, and again uses this semi-implicit time step. So if we're going to start again, how should we structure our code? How should we write our code? What should we do? We need a programming model. So we've stuck with Fortran. It's a high-level computing language. You've all heard of Fortran, right? Here's some Fortran on the right. Yeah, so here's some Fortran on the right. And it's an abstraction of the numerical mathematics where the implementation and architecture is hidden. The code is just text, which conforms to the semantics and syntax, the language definition. And then we have a compiler, which transforms the code into machine code for specific processes. And here we have this separation of concerns between the domain of the mathematics and the domain of the computer architecture. And this is very important because it means that we can take the same computer program and run it on a different computer by recompiling it. And so the fact that computer architectures are different, we don't actually have to change the code. And this is the ideal scenario we would like. Unfortunately, this abstraction is broken by all the parallel performance and memory features exposed, some of which Professor Fu was describing in his previous talk. And then we have to put it all back together again with all these kinds of different things: MPI, OpenMP, OpenACC, there's a whole zoo of different things, compiler directives, COCOS, one API SYCL from Intel, or you might have to look at A-thread if you want to run on the Toei Light machine. Not only the different things, they're all different sorts of things: libraries, extensions, directives, compiler directives. At the top is the nice design, API I wanted. At the bottom is the actual API I've got. And not only that, I don't know what happens if I switch one dial to 3 and turn the other knob to 4 at the same time, because there are multiple different programming models. This is not the programming model I wanted. This makes it very hard to port code and maintain code because the science code gets all mixed up with all this parallel and optimization code. And if you need to change the science code, it's very difficult. And if someone does change the science code, you have to go back and redo all the parallel and optimization code for the new system. So this makes it very difficult to maintain code in a sustainable way. So what is the Met Office going to do about this? We're going to take a domain-specific language approach. Why? Well, because as I've just described, there are too many programming models with rapid evolution of diverse hardware, and the programming models are not keeping up with they lag behind the new types of processor. And we have this parallel optimization code pollution into the science code that makes it very difficult to sustain the scientific development. So we're going to do this by using restoring the separation of concerns between the science code and the numerical code and the parallel optimization code. We're going to do this with using a layered software architecture, but we're going to embed it in Fortran, and we're going to use Fortran 2003 object-oriented code for our API. So here's our sort of programming model we have, where we have, for example, a single model, which is in this case the atmosphere model. We have a high-level picture of an algorithm, the algs, which operate on individual kernels, and in between those things we have the parallelization system. If we do that, we then can use this application called Cyclone, which is a Python application to parse, transform, and generate the code necessary for the parallelization system using its own intermediate representation. So Cyclone is mostly developed by our colleagues and partners at the STFC Hartree Centre, Rupert Ford, Andrew Porter and Sergi Siso, but people at the Met Office contribute to the development too, and also someone from Jörg Heinritz from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. So what does it do? Well, it is a domain-specific compiler. It has a parser, which can parse the source code that we write. It then generates the algorithm code, and it can generate the parallelization system code that goes between the layers. But we can also do transformations on that to introduce more parallelism or put in optimizations. So what does the algorithm layer look like? Well, it's just some Fortran. We have a keyword, which is invoke, which means do this in parallel. And then invoke operates on kernels. And a kernel operates on a single column of data. A kernel operates on fields at the algorithm layer, and they are data parallel global fields. You can have multiple kernels in a single invoke. This gives us a bigger scope for ordering, parallel communication, etc. And so this is what the algorithm layer kind of looks like. In the kernel code, we have metadata, and this is the key to making all this work. When we write our kernels, or domain scientist writes a kernel, they already have rich domain-specific information about what the kernel is going to do. We encode this as metadata, which we can then use to exploit for parallelism, for example, in the horizontal looping. And here we see some metadata here. So we embed it in Fortran, and it tells us that this kernel is going to operate on fields, an operator, what spaces they're on. This has meaning for the gung-ho and Elfric. And whether they're going to be fields read from, whether they're going to be incremented to, what they iterate over. And so we actually write down the things we know about the kernel, and this means that then Cyclone can read it and use that information. So this kernel does something called local matrix assembly in the cell, and the horizontal looping necessary will go on in the side layer. On the right, at the bottom panel, is just the kernel code itself, and it's just doing a matrix vector routine. So internally, what does this look like to Cyclone? So it's parsed the code, and it's made a schedule of the things it's going to do. It's found the keyword invoke, and it looks at what it's going to iterate over, and where does it iterate to. So this is the vanilla internal representation before it does anything. If we then say, okay, we're now going to do, we can apply a transformation which says we're going to do distributed memory. So now it's going to know it's going to have to do some halo exchanges. So it looks for everything that has to be read first, because that's contained in the kernel metadata. And if it has to be, if it's something's big, it needs to be the fields that need to be updated. So the fields the halo exchange is done before, because they're going to be read from, then these will then get the halo exchanges done before the kernel is called. And now the loop changes, the parallel loop changes inside, so that it only goes up to the last cell in the halo. We can do another transformation. We can add in OpenMP. So now we have to do, we have to add in this coloring. which is a bit like checkerboarding because we have shared mesh entities, so you could have neighboring cells both writing to the same shared face, for example. So we have an extra loop, add the OpenMP parallel directive, and now the loop that we go before we call the kernel, which is now parallel across OpenMP, is now goes across all the cells in that color. And so that we can do these transformations, and then we go back and generate the code. So now we can look at doing things like how can we change the algorithm that we're using to better suit the more parallel architectures. So in this case, redundant computation. So as I said, we might have two cells and a degree of freedom that we need to update that lives on a shared or partitioned, in this case, partitioned entity on an edge or a face. And these might receive contributions from both the own cell and the halo cell. So we can then switch on redundant computation into the halo cell for the shared DOF, and this means there's then less communication to update that. Now, if we do that, and we did it with just pure open MPI, for example, if we had 4 MPI ranks and they all have halos, that's shown in the green on the left, or we could do it with a hybrid mode where we had, for example, 1 MPI task and 4 OpenMP threads to working all across the shared halo. If we do redundant computation with the OpenMP version, there's less boundary to area scaling, means there's less work for the OpenMP threads to do, less redundant computation. And we can see that here. So this is looking at the scaling of the matrix vector. It's on something called a C288 mesh. So that's each panel, the cubed sphere, of which there are 6, has 288 by 288 cells. There are 30 levels. This is run on 96 nodes of the Met Office supercomputer, which is the Cray XE40 with Intel Broadwell Xeon processors. So there's 36 cores per node. So 1 MPI thread is 36 MPI ranks per node and one OpenMP thread. At the other end, there's 9 OpenMP threads with 4 OpenMP ranks per node. So the node is fully populated, but we're changing the ratio of MPI and OpenMP. As we move from the left to the right, we are increasing the number of OpenMP threads and decreasing the number of MPI ranks. And you can see that the redundant computation favors more threads because the amount of time it takes, it comes down because there's simply less work for the more highly threaded version to do. It's shown in the yellow bars. But we can do more than that. We can look at extending more redundant computation, what we call annex DOFs. So again, we might have these two adjacent cells where we have to update something on the boundary of one of them, and it occurs across a MPI partition. So the cell in P1 is owned, it has the degree of freedom owned in partition 1, but the cell in partition 2 also needs to update it, and that is called an annex DOF. Sometimes we do point-wise calculations. For example, if we set the value of a field to a scalar, we want to loop over all the degrees of freedom. And if we loop over all the own DOFs, we would need to do a halo exchange as required to get the answer right in partition 2 to get the information from partition 1. If we do redundant computation and loop over the annex DOFs, which we can do as a transformation cyclone, there's a small increase in the amount of redundant computation we do, but a large reduction in the number of halo exchanges. So again, we can see that if we look at the code. This is generated SciLayer code. Cyclone, something called a cyclone built-in, which can generate the code for setting something to a scalar. So the distributed memory, the halo exchange calls just go down to MPI. Y is increment, so it must be halo exchanged. X is red, so it also needs a halo exchange before we call the kernel, call matrix vector code down here. And you can see there's a halo exchange for both of them. If we switch on the redundant computation, then we see there's more code in the SciLayer now. And what we see is that here we've changed the looping so that we go out to the annex DOF. So the redundant computation into the halo threaded across OpenMP means that we now no longer have a halo exchange for the field Y, because we've done a redundant computation, so we don't need to do that, and we've got rid of one of the halo exchanges. Okay, so we will have this colouring loop order across the shared DOFs for OpenMP, so we can't fuse those two loops together because one of them has increment access. So the metadata in the kernel tells Cyclone what it can and can't do in order to get the right answer. If we look at that total cost of communication, the communication scaling, we looked at the computation scaling, which is definitely beneficial for redundant computation. We see a lot. We do the annex DOFs and redundant computation. We see very large reduction in the number of halo exchanges. And again, this is the scaling with respect to number of OpenMP threads. With fewer MPI ranks, there's fewer but larger messages. And with fewer MPI ranks, you might think the global sum might be faster as well. And so what we see here is you can see the plot. We see on the bottom, the light blue is the cost of the halo exchanges, and in the sort of teal color is the cost of the global sum. And if you add those two together, it's kind of fairly neutral, but it's certainly not, the cost of communication certainly doesn't go up if we do this, and it's beneficial to do for the computation. So we can do this, we can exchange computation for calculation and get some performance improvement. And of course, we can do all this without changing any of the science code, because this is all done by our code generator. We can look at reducing going further, look at the cost, reducing the cost of the global sums, look at what happens in our multi-grid solver. We turn on multi-grid, then we can look at what happens there. So if we use a different algorithm, we can change the algorithm. So this is now some quite large scaling. So this is a very fine mesh, a C1152. So that's 1152 by 1152 by 6. Because of 6 panels, again with 30 levels. That's roughly a 9-kilometer resolution. This is running the dynamics only with a quite large time step. Again on the Metaverse Create XC40 with 6 MPI ranks per node and 6 OpenMP threads. So that's, and we scale out to 3,500 nodes. So that's 124,000 cores. And the problem size per parallel element gets down to quite small here, to only 8 by 8. And we're going to compare 2 Krylov subspace solvers to the multi-grid solver. And we can look at the cost of doing that. So the top panel shows the relative cost of the Krylov subspace solvers compared to multi-grid. So here higher is better, and you can see that multi-grid is much faster and in fact scales better, because as we go out to the much higher number of cores, then the increased cost of doing the global sums for the Krylov subspace solver it means the global sums cost much more. The bottom panel shows parallel efficiency. One is perfect scaling, and you can see in the pale blue solid sticks there that the multi-grid solver, which has much less global communication, stays much closer to 1, whereas the Krylov subspace solves off. So again, by changing our algorithm, we can then better reduce the amount of communication we're doing. We can look at the costs of doing those halo exchanges, and the cost of MPI or reduce, which is the global sum, which we see in those plots there. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to quickly go to the next slide. We're also looking at doing things, how we develop things for accelerators with OpenACC. We can generate OpenACC code with Cyclone. We've tested this out on some kernels. This seems to work quite well. We can also, in principle, do OpenMP 4.5 style offload. We have problems with compiling the whole model. We have compiler bugs with compilers that can compile for GPUs, such as the Cray and PGI compiler, but we're working on getting those fixed. In principle, we can go further. We could look at generating OpenCL to feed into FPGA toolsets. We've done some experiments with that. That's been quite successful. In principle, we could even target COCOS or SICL, exploiting the rich domain information that we capture in the intermediate representation of Cyclone. And we have collaborations going with the US Air Force who use the unified model, and the Oak Ridge National Lab for experimenting on their GPU system there, using again using domain-specific language type approaches to try and help us get the performance we need. So conclusions. We have an xScale computing software challenge. How do we maintain single science source code for different programming models that exploit diverse architectures? So we're developing a domain-specific language for the model that we're developing to restore the separation of concerns between the math science code and the computational optimization parallel performance code. We can exploit the rich domain-specific information that there is in a weather and climate model to do this, and we can then generate different code for different processor architectures and maintain our single science source. This also allows us to have productive development of science code, so when someone changes the science code, we don't have to rewrite everything, we just regenerate the parallel code for the new science code. There's an interplay between the algorithm and programming model, and we've looked at that. Communication, reducing algorithms using an unstructured mesh for better scaling and exploiting redundant computation and thread scaling. And we're also looking at reduced precision, but I haven't had time to talk about that today. So I'll just finish by pointing at, with some papers if you want to know more. And I guess all this talk will be uploaded somewhere. And I seem to be going backwards. And I'll just leave you with an animation of a weather and climate simulation, because that's always good to see. Thank you.